Barry is not just stepping back into dating. Barry is stepping into a world that has moved on without him. And that is what makes this moment feel heavier than it first looks. Because on the surface, he is just sitting in a wellness center with Zach, going through the kind of relaxed, slightly awkward routine people do when they are trying to act like everything is normal. But underneath that calm setting is a man quietly admitting that he is trying to figure out romance again after a huge stretch of his life was already defined by marriage, family, structure, and certainty. That is why the sauna conversation matters more than it should, because Barry is not sitting across from a date in a restaurant. He is not making some grand confession, and he is not having a dramatic breakdown. He is sweating through an ordinary conversation with Zach while revealing that Renee, his matchmaker, is still working to help him find someone, and that one woman from Tennessee had already made it far enough for a real phone call. At first, the story almost sounds hopeful because Barry says they talked for about an hour, and that detail alone tells viewers there was enough there to keep the conversation alive, enough curiosity, enough energy, enough possibility for Barry to not immediately shut the door. And when he describes her as fun and as someone who likes experiencing life, it almost feels like this could be the kind of person who brings motion back into a chapter of Barry's life that has been standing still for a long time. But then the whole mood shifts, and it does not shift because of attraction, rejection, distance, or some obvious red flag. It shifts because the conversation touches Halloween, and suddenly something that sounds small starts to feel much bigger. Because Barry is not just talking about one holiday. He is showing the audience where his comfort zone begins and where his uncertainty starts pushing back. That is the part that makes this uncomfortable in a way viewers can feel, because Barry may want companionship. But the bigger question is whether he wants the kind of companionship that challenges him, stretches him, and asks him to adapt, or whether he is searching for someone who can enter his world without forcing that world to move too much. Zach listens with support, and that helps the scene feel less harsh, but it also makes it more revealing, because Barry is relaxed enough to say the quiet part out loud, and once he does, the audience has to wonder if this is a man being careful with his values, or a man protecting himself from the discomfort of someone different. And that is where the real tension sits, because Renee can keep finding names, numbers, and possible matches, but she cannot do the emotional work for Barry. She cannot decide which differences matter and which differences simply scare him, and she cannot make him ready for a relationship that may require more than polite conversation and shared interests. So when Barry says he will keep trying, that sounds like progress, but it also leaves the most important question wide open. Is Barry trying to open himself up to a new future, or is he only searching until he finds someone who makes the future feel exactly like the past, just with a different face sitting beside him? The part that makes Barry's dating story more interesting is that he is not doing this completely alone, because Renee is there as the matchmaker, the person who is supposed to help him step into a world that probably feels unfamiliar, uncomfortable, and maybe even a little strange after so many years of his life being built around marriage, family, and a very specific routine. But even with someone guiding him, even with someone handing him a name, a number, and a possible connection, Barry still has to face the one part nobody else can handle for him, which is deciding whether he is actually open to being changed by another person. That is where this gets more complicated. Because on paper, having a matchmaker sounds like the smart move for Barry, since he is not trying to casually throw himself into modern dating and hope for the best. He is trusting someone who has experience, someone who can filter people, listen to what he wants, and maybe help him avoid wasting time with someone who clearly does not fit. But the problem is that a matchmaker can only open a door. She cannot decide whether Barry is emotionally ready to walk through it without bringing every old fear, old standard, and old habit with him. And that is why the woman from Tennessee matters, even though viewers do not know much about her. Because the little Barry does say creates a picture that sounds promising at first. She was fun. She enjoyed experiencing life, and the call lasted long enough that it clearly was not dead on arrival. So for a moment, it feels like maybe this could be a small win, not some huge romantic breakthrough. Not the beginning of a perfect love story. but at least proof that Barry can still connect with someone new. But then the Halloween detail comes in, and suddenly the whole conversation starts to feel less like Barry evaluating a woman and more like Barry revealing the checklist inside his own mind, because the issue may not be whether Halloween itself matters. The issue is why that difference landed hard enough for him to bring it up at all, and that is where viewers start asking the uncomfortable question. Is Barry being wise about compatibility? Or is he using compatibility as a way to stay close to what already feels safe? There is nothing wrong with having standards, and Barry should not pretend to be fine with something that genuinely bothers him, but standards can do two very different things. They can protect someone from the wrong relationship, or they can become armor that keeps the right relationship from ever getting close enough to challenge them. And with Barry, the tension is that nobody can fully tell yet which one is happening. That is also what makes Zach's presence important, because Zach gives Barry a place to say these things without the scene turning aggressive, but his support also softens the moment, and that leaves another question sitting underneath the conversation. Is Zach watching Barry grow into this new chapter? Or is he simply making the chapter feel safer than it really is? So by the end of this part of the story, Barry does not look hopeless, but he also does not look fully ready. He looks like a man standing between two versions of himself, one version that wants companionship, possibility, and a fresh start, and another version that still wants the new person to fit inside an old emotional map. And the real tension is not whether Renee can find him another match. It is whether Barry can recognize a good one if she does not arrive exactly the way he imagined. This is where Barry's dating story stops being simple, because the same moment can make him look responsible to one viewer and emotionally closed off to another. And that split is exactly why this scene has more weight than a normal dating update, because Barry is not a teenager figuring out attraction for the first time. He is a divorced man trying to enter romance again after years of living inside. One structure, one family system, and one version of himself that probably felt familiar even when it was complicated. For some viewers, Barry's reaction makes sense, because after everything he has lived through, why would he rush into a connection just because one phone call went well? And why would he ignore a lifestyle difference if that difference tells him something important about how a woman sees the world? Because at this stage in life, dating is not just about fun chemistry or liking someone's voice over the phone. It is about asking whether this person can actually fit into the life he wants to build next. That side of the audience may see Barry as careful, not cold, because he is finally putting himself out there, trusting Renee to help him, admitting to Zach that he is trying, and being honest enough to notice when something feels off instead of forcing excitement just because he wants the process to work. And there is a fair argument there, because starting over after a long marriage is not easy. And nobody should have to pretend a difference does not matter just to look more open-minded on television. But the other side sees the same moment in a completely different way. Because to them, the Tennessee woman sounded like someone with energy, personality, and a real interest in enjoying life. And instead of that sounding like a chance for Barry to experience something fresh, the conversation seemed to turn into a quiet inspection where one detail about Halloween became enough to make the whole connection feel uncertain. And that raises a more uncomfortable question about whether Barry is truly looking for someone new or only someone new who feels almost exactly like what he already understands. That is the difficult line here, because values and fear can look very similar from the outside, and humans, in their endless talent for making everything emotionally inconvenient, can call something a boundary when it is really a shield, or call something rigidity when it is actually wisdom. And with Barry, the scene does not give a clean answer. It gives just enough information to keep viewers arguing about what they are really watching. Zach's role makes the moment even more revealing, because Barry is not opening up to a stranger who might challenge him too hard. He is sitting with someone close enough to understand the family, close enough to listen without turning the conversation into an attack, and that soft landing lets Barry speak more freely. But it also means Zach's support may make the scene feel safer than the dating process. actually is. So the tension is not whether Barry is allowed to have preferences, because he clearly is. And it is not whether every fun woman should automatically be a good match, because that would be ridiculous, even by reality TV standards. The real tension is whether Barry's caution will help him choose better, or whether it will quietly narrow his world until every possible match feels wrong for being different. And when Barry says he will keep trying, that sounds hopeful, but it still leaves the biggest question hanging over the whole dating arc. Will each new woman help Barry expand into a different future? Or will each conversation only prove how tightly he is still holding on to the life he already knows? What makes Barry's dating journey heavier at this point is that the hardest part is no longer getting started, because he has already done that. He has already admitted that he is willing to try. He has already trusted Renee enough to let her help him, and he has already taken the step of speaking to a woman who sounded interesting, energetic, and open to experiencing life. But now the real cost of trying begins to show. Because dating again does not just mean meeting people, it means being exposed again and again to possibility, disappointment, uncertainty, and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the issue is not the person on the other end of the phone. Sometimes the issue is the expectation Barry brings into the conversation before it even starts. That is why the Tennessee woman becomes more than just a name in the story. Because she represents the kind of connection that could look promising at first and still make Barry hesitate. Not because something dramatic happened, not because the conversation collapsed, but because one lifestyle difference made him pause long enough for viewers to wonder what kind of partner Barry is actually searching for, and whether he wants someone who brings life into his world or someone who fits neatly inside the world he already knows. The uncomfortable part is that both things can be true at the same time, because Barry can genuinely want companionship and still be afraid of how much companionship might change him. He can want a fresh start and still prefer the emotional safety of familiar patterns. And he can say he is willing to keep trying while quietly hoping that the right woman will not require him to stretch too far beyond the version of himself he already understands. That is where Zach's presence starts to matter in a deeper way, because Zach is not just sitting there as someone to fill the scene. He is a younger married man inside the same family system, someone close enough to listen without making Barry feel judged, and that creates a subtle role reversal that gives the moment more emotional weight, because Barry, who has often stood in the position of the older father figure, is now the one explaining uncertainty, the one talking through dating nerves, the one trying to sound steady while admitting that this new chapter is still messy. And that shift is important because it shows Barry in a position viewers do not always see him in, not as the man with everything figured out, not as the calm authority standing outside the drama, but as someone who is learning in real time that the second chapter of life does not come with a clean instruction manual, which is deeply inconvenient for everyone involved and especially for reality TV. Audiences who keep expecting emotional growth to arrive neatly packaged between commercial breaks. The danger for Barry is that being selective can protect him, but it can also isolate him if every difference starts to feel like a warning sign. Because if he is looking for someone fun but not too unpredictable, open to life but not too different, compatible but not challenging, warm but not disruptive, then the search can become smaller and smaller until almost nobody feels safe enough to choose. So by this point, Barry still looks hopeful, but the hope comes with pressure, because every new conversation will now test more than chemistry. It will test whether he can separate real incompatibility from discomfort, whether he can let a woman be different without seeing that difference as a threat, and whether he is truly searching for a partner or searching for proof that he can start over without having to change. By the end of this part of Barry's dating story, the answer is not as simple as saying he is ready or he is not ready, because the truth sits somewhere in the middle, and that is what makes the whole situation feel more real than a clean reality TV label, since Barry has clearly reached the point where he is willing to begin again, willing to trust Renee, willing to speak to someone new, and willing to admit out loud to Zach that the dating world is now part of his life. But being willing to start is not the same thing as being ready to stretch. That is the real difference viewers have to sit with. Because Barry is not wrong for having standards, and he is not suddenly a romantic hero just because he made a phone call after years away from dating. He is a man trying to rebuild a personal life after the structure that used to define him has changed. And when that happens, dating becomes less about finding the perfect person and more about discovering what parts of yourself are still flexible enough to grow. The conversation with Zach shows progress, and it should not be ignored, because Barry is not completely shut down. He is not pretending he does not want companionship, and he is not acting like Renee can magically deliver a perfect relationship to his door without him having to participate. But the Halloween issue also shows that the next stage of this journey will be harder than simply meeting women, because Barry will have to decide which differences are true incompatibilities and which differences only feel threatening because they are unfamiliar. That is why the woman from Tennessee matters, even if she never becomes a bigger part of the story, because she works like a mirror, showing what Barry notices first, what makes him pause, what kind of energy attracts him, and what kind of difference makes him pull back. And sometimes a person who does not become the relationship still reveals the exact lesson the relationship search was meant to expose. Renee can keep introducing him to possibilities, and Zach can keep offering the kind of calm support that makes Barry feel less alone. But neither of them can do the emotional work for him, because the real test is not whether Barry can get another number, another call, or another match. The real test is whether he can let a real person be different from the person he imagined without immediately treating that difference like a warning sign. And that is where this dating arc becomes bigger than romance, because Barry is not just looking for a woman, he is trying to figure out who he becomes now, that the old marriage, the old family structure, and the old certainty are no longer holding his identity in place, which is why this story does not need betrayal, shouting, or scandal to matter, because sometimes the heaviest thing on screen is just a man trying to step into a new life while one hand is still gripping the old one. So the question Barry leaves behind is not whether he should keep trying, because he already says he will. The question is whether every new match will help him open up to a future he cannot fully control, or whether each difference will send him searching again for someone who feels safe enough to never change him at all.